How's everyone doing today? Good. Yeah, come on. It's day 2. Honestly, it's been such a fantastic conference. I know it's been very dynamic. We've had some fantastic sessions, and I'm sure everyone's a little bit tired after the last 2 days. So I do want to thank you for joining me today. Well, I get to discuss a little bit about a topic that sometimes we don't really hear about in this sphere as much, right? I mean, we have a lot of discussions that have to do with business strategy. We've talked quite a bit about data governance. And obviously, we've touched upon the elephant in the room, as I like to call it, artificial intelligence and machine learning. But with that, a lot of times, we don't get to necessarily talk about IP strategy. And there's a reason for that, actually. And it's because, as we've all heard, you can't patent AI. So why would we bother? Why would you even start to have that conversation about essentially building some kind of IP portfolio? Because we are very technical and we've been in this industry for a while, we know that models are math and math is recreatable. We know that this field is moving extremely fast, especially in the last 5 years. So if we build something, what's the chances that it's going to become obsolete, right? Like, for example, and this is an interesting example, if you remember correctly, about 4 years ago, I want to say, chunking was extremely popular. Now almost no one is talking about it. And besides that, there's open source a little bit of everywhere, so really, where's the advantage? Well, that's because you're looking in the wrong place. The model is rarely the moat. I mean, if you think about it, there's a lot of things around the model that recreate the system that could be protected. And some of these things include unique processes and architecture. This includes things like even your data flows, as well as proprietary structured data sets. I know I'm supposed to be just talking about patents, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the IP portfolio overall in the data sphere. So proprietary structured data sets, you could actually copyright those. And those have quite a bit of value. And as we know, data is only increasing in value every year as we go on. But then you also have things like the workflows and the evaluation methods, and also how does it all come together as a system? Because a lot of times when we're designing these type of AI or ML solutions, we're not just doing plug and play. I know that there are some solutions that are plug and play. We have some kind of idea, we just plug AI into it and expect some kind of output. And as we've all seen, because let alone only in 2025, we have wasted globally $547 billion on AI pilots that did not work. I'm sure the numbers we've heard everywhere from 87% to, I believe I've heard a 95 and 99% of AI pilots are failing. That's a lot to do plug and play, a little bit of data governance, but if we really think about sustainable systems, there's a lot that comes into creating an AI or ML solution. And so there are components around it that you can protect. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, so I work for this company called Picsumi. We are a SaaS company in the HR tech sphere, and we had this conversation about, okay, we're spending all this money building. We actually designed and built an AI-centric system that is bias mitigating for ranking candidates according to a position. Why did we do that? Now, I'm sure you might have heard Workday, because of their ATS system, is in a massive class action lawsuit because they didn't consider the fact that their system was integrating bias into it, and you can look at that in the US. So we wanted to do something that took into consideration multiple components of responsible AI. We were approaching this problem in a different way. So how can we protect that? Well, it's really hard to protect things like an AI system that scores candidates. You'll have to excuse me, I have really bad eyesight. A known algorithm, as we know, math is recreatable, mathematical result, and so on. But what is protectable? Well, a specific pipeline that transforms unstructured input into a structured scored signal. A novel architecture for our data flow that yields a concrete technical improvement. A unique method for generating and or validating training data. And how do I know that this is protectable? Well, we submitted our system for essentially 3 patents to review. We were pre-approved for 3 of them, and 2 are actually patent pending. So that goes to show that in this industry, there is potential to have IP protection on the innovations that are you creating. And why wouldn't you want to do it? I mean, we're all here, we're all talking about what's happening in the data landscape. We're all building something innovative, cutting edge. I mean, that's all we've talked about for the last 2 days, really. So why not turn that into an asset, really, that you can have on the books? Why not turn it into the competitive advantage that it should be? So, as I keep clicking. So what are the 5 categories that we can kind of look at when we're looking at our solutions, when we're looking at our system? I like to break it down into these 5 categories. So your data sets, your architecture, your workflows, your evaluation, and your process innovation. So as I mentioned, data sets have a lot of value. By creating proprietary, structured, or uniquely labeled data, and the methods used to build and validate it, you can actually have something that you can incorporate in your IP portfolio. Your architecture, and I really can't stress this enough, depending on your data flow, you do have potential for putting that up also for a patent in of itself. And again, we've talked a lot about data flows, we've talked a lot about data governance, we've talked a lot about processes. Your workflows as well, so even insofar as how you incorporate that human in the loop, which ones are these touch points that you've created and integrated into your system for humans to essentially be decision makers? That workflow also has potential for essentially becoming an IP asset. Your evaluation metrics, and then the overall process innovation. We've approached things in different ways, so why not take a look into, well, how can I essentially turn that into an asset in of itself? And I want you guys to keep these 5 categories in mind as I continue throughout this presentation, because we're going to come back to them. So again, I'm going to bring it back to my company where essentially we've worked on this. We've done this for about 2 years to kind of build out a proper solution and be able to protect it. So where does our IP kind of live in of right now? So what we really wanted to do was we set out to replace the resume. The resume hasn't changed since the 1600s. I believe Da Vinci was the first person to create a resume. And so we wanted to turn that into proper structured data. And so we created an entire system that essentially we could do that and rank our qualified candidates to positions. So something that we looked at were things like resume to profile conversion. So what was this method that turned this really jumbled, inconsistent mess of data that we've seen from essentially a resume, a piece of paper, that now what are we doing? We've turned it into a PDF file, we've turned it into a Word document. It's a struggle to parse. Well, why not structure that? So we created an entire process that would essentially create better data ingestion, better data storage, a better process overall. And then what about non-biased scoring? I did mention Workday. I always like to bring that case up. But if you really look, a lot of ATS systems have problems in of themselves, let alone the fact that most of the time, if you're applying for a position, not only do you have to plug in information manually, but then you also have to upload your resume on top of that, right? And those ATS systems are usually incorporating some kind of ML AI, probably some plug and play, that are scoring you and might be based off of like covariates, they might deny you, which is essentially some bias factors. So we knew we wanted to approach this from a responsible AI perspective, so why not turn that into an asset? And then intake and qualification flow. So really a mobile-first, resume-free intake workflow that's a standalone signals downstream into any ATS or IRS. So essentially just like this integratability. So why am I mentioning all of this? Well, I'm talking about all of this because I want to say that, yes, patents are very strong, and there is potential in this industry to essentially have patents placed on your solutions and on your builds. And why would you choose patents? Well, patents essentially are probably the strongest form of IP that you can integrate, and they're fantastic if you want to look at things like your architecture and your workflow, and there's potential there. But a lot of times when we're talking about AI and ML solutions, you're going to tend to talk about either patenting or trade secrets. Now, as I mentioned, when we're talking about math, very recreatable, you can reverse engineer it very easily. So the conversation here has to be about, well, should something remain a trade secret in terms of processes in your workflow? Or is this something that could be patentable? And there's a couple different considerations that we're going to take into mind. Now, besides that, I did mention proprietary data sets. This would fall under copyright. And I do mention here a little bit about process and evaluation frameworks, but another component is also industrial design. So a lot of times for industrial design, people consider that it's just hardware-based, but there are components here that you could take into consideration along with your user interface. So there's potential. I would say you would have to discuss with a lawyer further depending on what you're looking at, but all that to say that there is potential with UI as well to include that in your IP portfolio. So as you can see, there's multiple tools that we can use in this sphere in order to turn our innovations and everything that we've been working on into assets that actually can reflect on your books as well. And then you can lead into other things such as licensing and so on and so forth. Speaking of which, since I'm talking about this, a show of hands, how many people have considered some kind of IP protection for the systems that they're designing? I see one in the back. So that's everything that you kind of need to know. We're not talking enough about this. We're devoting a lot of our time and resources, and we're not talking about how to protect the innovations that we're creating. So, as I mentioned, the two big discussions that we usually have in this area is, should it be a patent or should it remain a trade secret? So essentially, this is kind of a practical test that you can use. First step is you can ask yourself, depending on where you are in your workflow, what you're kind of deciding on, you can say, can a competitor detect this in my product? Could it be reverse engineered from the output? If it can, then that means that you should not patent it. You should consider it as a trade secret. That includes things with NDAs, contracts, and so on and so forth. But that would be one point in which you would decide, this is something in my system that is not patentable. The second question you would ask yourself, okay, does it lose value once it's disclosed? What does that mean? So patents, you can go and look them up and see essentially how they're structured. So if it's disclosed and it's publicly available to see this patent, is it going to lose its value? Are other people going to be able to go and utilize it in some capacity, or is it just something that no one's going to find value in using this product? And if that's the case, then once again, you should consider trade secret. And then finally, is it concrete and novel enough to claim? What does that mean? That means, is it unique enough? Is it some kind of innovation that has been created that's really made a difference in any kind of system that's designed of this type? Is it something that no one's really thought of and you've implemented and it's really creating outputs that are recreatable, unique, something that we haven't seen before? And if that's the case, if it is concrete and novel enough to claim, then you would think patent. So these are all considerations that you can take into place as you're trying to evaluate the system that you've designed and the components. Again, you want to kind of base this off of the 5 components that I talked about earlier. So how do we kind of build this into our life cycle? There's so much that we're thinking about. So I know a lot of people like roadmaps and like essentially what the life cycle looks like. Where can I plug this in? I've kind of created like 5 different points at which you can integrate this IP discussion. The first is at ideation. So as you start thinking about a solution, you can start to evaluate it across those 5 different categories that we've talked about. And you can see, well, does it have potential to be able to discuss this further, maybe at the next step? Now, as you're prototyping, you want to keep a log of the invention. And why do you want to do that? Because in Canada, you're going to have to disclose the inventors as well, by the way. So not just the company, but essentially the individuals who have worked on the project. So you want to keep a log of these different inventions that you can also go through and ensure that this is something that you want to move forward with, scrap, so on and so forth. And then during the build phase, so as you're building it, you're going to go back and see, okay, these are the components that we've kind of removed from this innovation log. These are the components that we are keeping. Is this something that's patentable? And you're going to ask yourself those questions. Is it patentable? Could it be a trade secret? What does this look like in terms of my IP portfolio? And then once it's at launch, this is when you should be filing your provisions. This is when you should be filing with your lawyers, so that way you can protect the assets that you've created. And then you're scaling. And depending on what you've decided to do, you could also consider licensing if that's something that you wanted to move forward with. So as you can see, IP really should be a part of your overall life cycle as you're trying to build these innovations. You should be considering it, I don't want to say on the daily, but as you're working on improving some kind of system that you're working on. And as we all know, we're all very focused on the systems, the workflows, the processes that we're building and that we're trying to innovate. We're really trying to make a mark on creating a solution that works, especially in this sphere where, in AI, as we've mentioned, most pilots are failing, right? So if you have something good, you should be considering how you're going to protect it. On top of that, I'm not sure if most of you are aware, but Canada does provide funding for a lot of IP. I've kind of put up a couple of these here. So there's Elevate IP, there's IP Assist, there's Shred for tax incentives, and then there's also Innovation Action Collective. This is more for clean tech, but there's other programs as well that exist, including things like IPON. Why am I mentioning this? Because a lot of times when we're discussing IP as well, there's that barrier that has to do with funding and whether there's going to be real value in spending those dollars and those resources on funding your IP portfolio. So there are opportunities here because Canada does want to invest in technology within its borders. And this is something that you can take advantage of. Again, there's more caveats in there, and there are different things that the funding entities do request, but all this to say that there is real value in this sector because they have funded different IP portfolios across Canada, specifically within the data and AI sphere. So this is something that we should be considering. This is something that we should be bringing up. So what is a defensible advantage? Well, essentially, it's three things aligned. It's the technical innovation, governance, and commercialization. These are all three things that we should be, once again, considering. So our technical innovation is the novel data sets, the architectures, the workflows, and evaluation methods you actually built. This is essentially a lot of the technical stuff that we've been talking about during the conference, right? We've all been innovating to one degree or another, taking different components, designing these systems, trying to find a better way to give the outputs that we're looking for. Sometimes we're trying to work around models that might not necessarily be for the use case, or we're trying to adapt these models for the use case that we're trying to utilize. Then there's governance. We've had many discussions about governance, data governance, AI governance, and so on and so forth. But a component of governance is also, for example, how your IP might align with the solutions that you're essentially creating. Here I have things like IP assignment contracts, data rights, bias controls, and so on and so forth. And then commercialization. So this is where you're aligning with protected assets and how you'll sell, license, integrate, and scale these products. So all three of these components really come together to create this defensible advantage that you can have in terms of this IP portfolio that you can create for the solutions that you have built. So with that, I would say that the 5 key takeaways that I would like for you guys to take from this presentation is that you can't patent AI, but you can protect the system around the model. You can look at the different components that you have integrated into the total system and protect these different aspects. Always think about the 5 different categories when you're doing your engineering life cycle. You want to think about data sets, architectures, workflows, evaluation, and the overall process. You want to consider how and whether you have the ability to protect these assets that you have built as a part of that process. And then you can layer your protection. I've talked a lot about patents and trade secrets, a little bit about copyright, a little bit about industrial design. Proprietary data, again, is a very, very big one. I really do want to stress this one because, as we know, we're kind of running out of data. I've talked to different companies, and as you guys have probably been aware, the LLMs are running out of data to essentially scan and build better and bigger models. Data is going to increasingly become this out-of-reach commodity that a lot of people in this industry are going to be looking for. I mean, if you really think about it, how many of us have been in a situation where we want to build something and the data needed to build it just isn't there? Whether it's not structured properly, there isn't enough volume, or it just doesn't meet the use case. Actually, show of hands, how many people have run into this problem? Okay, I see that we have a shy crowd because I see people's hands slowly going up, but I saw about half the room. So this is a real scenario that we're actually facing. Your proprietary data is valuable, and that's something that you should take into consideration. The fourth takeaway, make IP decisions early. A public disclosure can close the door. What do I mean by that? Well, you have to decide whether IP is the route that you want to go down, whether you do want to protect these assets that you are building, whether you consider that a part of your portfolio. Now, keep in mind, not all businesses necessarily protect all the different types of IP. There's advantages to some IPs over others, and some companies essentially build their entire data strategies around some of their IP. So, for example, Apple is a big one. They really do enjoy IP, and that's a big proponent of their company overall. So really consider if and how you want to integrate intellectual property, not just as a business strategy, but as part of your engineering strategy as well. And then finally, use Canada's programs. Canada does have different types of funding that is available, and there's a reason for that. As we've seen, the government is really looking to bolster not just our technology portfolio, but even our security portfolio as well. So they're really investing into that, and there's no reason why you can't take advantage of that in order to build a better IP strategy for yourself. Well, thank you very much for your time, guys. I believe, open for questions. I have a couple of minutes. So does anyone have any questions?
We've got some questions for Andrea. Have a look around. We saw some, yeah, just over there. Mic runners. We're going to give you a mic. What's your name? And
my name is Shebnam, Unity Health. I think so. Might be a little bit of controversial question, but I was thinking about privacy. So assuming that you have my resume is my own personal information, is that correct? So you can't own it?
Well, it depends. So if you've essentially run through a transformation process for it and you've submitted it, so you've kind of consented to submitting to data ingestion.
So that ingested and reformatted data becomes yours?
There is a process to it. I would have to explain more, like I'd have to consult more like the legal parts of it. We do have a legal document that explains how that aspect works. But yes, essentially, we would own that data depending on where the consent was for that.
Yeah, I was trying to think how the privacy section of it works. Is that information available on your website, maybe?
No. So do you mean like each individual person's resume? Is it available on the website?
No. The transformation process and the rights of the individual.
Yep. Okay. We have that all on the website if you want to check it out.
Okay, I'll have a look there. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
yeah, anyone else got a question? Right chair, okay.
Hi, Robert Burns, Crosslinks Transit. In terms of trade secrets, obviously AI and technology is very different than Coca-Cola, who can put it in a safe and not let anybody at it. Mm-hmm. It's obviously going to be on a server somewhere. It's, while it's protected, it's still out there. Mm-hmm. What's the best methods other than normal cybersecurity protocols, do you think, for, because that's very, very important to you and you never want it to get out, to keep that safe?
So trade secrets are they're not the easiest types of IP to protect, as you are aware. Cybersecurity is the best way to do it, but there's also ways that you can set up things in terms of also the contracts, the NDAs, and so on and so forth. You also want to make sure that the number of individuals who are exposed to that trade secret are limited as well. So obviously, if it's a trade secret, you're not going to share it with the entire company because that creates risk in of itself. You're going to try and limit that to essentially just the key individuals that would be required to understand how that works, right? And this is an advantage because you can kind of determine which parts of the team also have access to that information, because keep in mind, as information flows, you can kind of decide who's going to have access to that based off of management and so on and so forth. But there is always a risk associated with trade secrets. I mean, we've heard it time and time again that trade secrets do end up coming out. Sometimes it's a disgruntled employee and so on and so forth. Nonetheless, there is value in maintaining it for as long as you might be able to, right? 5 years is still better than 0 years. So does that answer your question?
Great. We got one more question in the back.
Hey, how are you? Thanks. This is actually a really cool topic. I'm surprised that it came up here, but very, very cool. I've run into this from a backwards perspective where I've been trying to do funding support, and I've realized that IP is an opportunity. I don't know that I can figure out how to deal with that all by myself. What kind of resources would you recommend that are available out there to support? So twofold. One, both on the funding support side. So I'm looking at IRAP, I'm looking at SHRED and how it works. And it's really complicated to figure out what is and isn't eligible.
Yeah.
But I figure it's very much aligned with IP. And if I learn on one side, it probably is valuable on the other. Where would I be able to do this and find resources to support me?
So I'm going to be very honest with you. So we worked with IPON. IPON is another actually funding entity, but they're local to Ontario. So essentially, if your headquarters is located in Ontario, you are eligible to go through their program. And they have a fantastic portal where they actually teach you about the different components of intellectual property. And then what you can do is you can take that information and decide how you want to move forward. But on top of that, one of sometimes the barriers that could be considered with IP in this area is that you would also need to have some kind of legal counsel that would be able to work with you as well as with the funding entity to kind of move forward to ensure that you have a smoother process. But I do recommend IPON if you are in Ontario. Otherwise, I haven't seen very good open source information that's readily available in terms of IP strategy. Again, always talking in this tech sphere. As you can see, it's very limited in tech. I find that this is something that people tend to have more conversations about in other industries, as opposed to specifically here when I'm talking about data, AI, machine learning, and so on. I hope that answers your question. No problem.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's... if anyone's got more questions for Andrea, she'll be outside just after our last session, which is the end of the summit. So Andrea, thank you so much. That was a really generous session.